Hello.
Hello.
Well, good morning. You can probably tell by my voice that it's quite early. But I'm on my way to get some air brakes training done. Well, that's day one complete. I'm tired. Looking forward to day two. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, this is the traffic I'm in. Well, it's official. I have my Z, or Z, depending on where you live. I was very nervous, but I passed with flying colors, so 95% on the written test and 90-something% on the practical test. So I'd say that's pretty darn good. So now I'm heading home and gonna celebrate. Then back to work tomorrow.
I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Cinnamon Roll, and I'm building a school bus into my home. So yeah, for those of you who are interested, I took my air brakes course through a company in London, Ontario called OTDS, or Ontario Truck Driving School. It was a 2-day course with the written and practical tests included in the course. They provided the truck for the practical, which saved me a lot of time and money. And no, I'm not sponsored by OTDS, I'm just giving you the information for what I did. So yeah, I'm legally allowed to drive a vehicle with air brakes in Ontario now. A couple of videos ago, I tore apart that camper that I bought for $50, and I kept some of the windows to be used on the bus. As can be expected, they were pretty filthy, so I gave them a good scrubbing down to remove all the sticky residue and chunks of insulation that were stuck to them. Once they were relatively clean, I began the process of installing these windows. The reason I kept these specific windows is because they are emergency exit windows. My plan was to have one in the bedroom and one in the living room of the bus. At this point, I hadn't yet done a floor plan, but I had a basic idea of what layout I wanted, so I put the windows in spots where I knew for sure there wouldn't be any walls. I started by making a template. I took some of this thick paper and set the window frame on top of it. I traced the frame onto the paper with some pencil, and then cut along the lines, making sure that the template would be slightly oversized to allow for some wiggle room. I did some measurements to figure out where I wanted the first window to go. I decided that I wanted the windows as high as possible without interfering with the drip rails of the bus. I did this for 2 reasons. The first is that I needed the clearance for the bed, which will sit quite high, and the second is that I wanted most of the windows at eye level so that I don't have to bend over to enjoy the views. Once I'd figured out my measurements, I drilled a bunch of holes large enough to get my jigsaw blade in. This also helped me to locate where to put the template on the outside of the bus. I used painter's tape to hold the template to the bus and then traced it onto the metal. After that, I chucked up a metal blade into my jigsaw and began cutting out the window. I couldn't do the entire window with just the jigsaw because I had to cut through some of the hat channels, so I grabbed the Sawzall and used that to finish the window opening. I used a grinder with a flat wheel disc to clean up the edges and to fine-tune the opening to fit the window frame. After making sure that the frame would fit properly, I used some self-drilling screws to temporarily hold the window frame in the opening. Once I was satisfied with the frame's placement, I slid the window into the frame to keep it relatively watertight. For the next window, unfortunately all my tools and appliances were sitting right in front of where I needed it to go, so I had to do some initial cleanup and move everything to the other side of the bus. Something that I didn't account for was that where I wanted the window to be was where the wire for this blinker ran. For now I just pulled it out of the way, but it will need to be rewired later. So I decided to put this window lower than the one at the back because this is closer to where I plan to have my entertainment unit and drums, which means that when I'm looking out this window I will be sitting down. I did the same process for this window that I did for the last one, so I'm going to make this a time lapse with some snazzy music. So I noticed that the quick releases for these windows were a bit on the tight side, so I adjusted them out a bit to make things easier for myself. Now that the emergency exit windows were mocked in, I turned my attention to the RV style windows. These windows are designed to sandwich the inner and outer walls of an RV between the inner and outer flanges of the window to essentially clamp it into place. For my application, the walls are going to be much thicker than a typical RV, so I had to build these frames to make up the difference in thickness. I preemptively screwed the inner flange to the window to make later installation easier. I measured the distance between the inner and outer flange to get the thickness I would need for the inner frame. I took this measurement and subtracted 1/8 of an inch to account for the width of the outer shell of the bus. I then took some 3/4 inch plywood and, using a straight edge, cut strips with the circular saw to size. I didn't use a table saw for these cuts because I was unable to handle these sheets of plywood by myself into the table saw with any sort of accuracy. I marked the top of the window with a paint marker so that I wouldn't mess that up later, and then I measured my heights and widths. Using these measurements, I cut the strips of plywood into the lengths that I would need for the inner frame. I then assembled the inner frame. First, I pre-drilled my holes with a countersink bit, and then hooked everything together with screws. And that's the inner frame complete. Now that I'd built what I needed to install the window, I next had to account for the thickness of the wall itself. I did this with a second outer frame that would attach to the inner frame. I measured this frame larger and thicker and did the same process of cutting strips and hooking it all together with screws. I know this sounds a bit confusing, but now that you can see what I'm building, hopefully this makes a little more sense. I made another template for this window, and then began working on building the frames for the 2 camper windows that I mocked in earlier. I didn't have to account for width as much with these windows because the way that they were mounted didn't require me to build a double frame like with the newer RV windows. So I built 2 identical boxes at the width I needed for the wall. Once that was complete, I went back and removed the 2 camper windows, and then because I had installed the front one a little crooked, I made some adjustments to the opening to straighten it out a bit. Now, because I had to cut through the hatch channels to accommodate the window openings, I needed to strengthen them up. I did this by welding in some, of course, bed frame. So the middle section was bowing out a little, so I used a ratchet strap to pull everything straight while I welded it into place. I did the same process for the back. I gave the outside a quick sand to smooth out the edges and remove any welding spatter, and then primed around the opening to prevent it from rusting. Next, I figured out where I wanted the kitchen window to go and cut the hole for that as well. After quickly sanding that window opening as well, I went around with the primer and painted every weld and exposed metal surface that I had just made. Here's where I began prepping for final installation of the camper windows. I bought this butyl tape which will serve as the waterproofing between the flanges of all the windows and the outer surfaces of the bus. This stuff is awesome. It doesn't dry out, which means that it will flex and move with the bus and will also squeeze out to prevent any leaks from happening. It's also marine grade, which means that it should weather the elements very well. Now this stuff handles like sticky Play-Doh, and I laid down a strip onto the outer flange of every window. I set the window into place, and then clamped it to the wooden frame that I built earlier. I then pre-drilled through the outer steel of the bus, and then hooked everything together with screws. And that's that window installed. I repeated the process for the back window, and then began to install the kitchen window. The process to install these RV-style windows is a little different than the other windows I just did. They're designed so that everything can be done from the inside. I added butyl tape to the outer flange just like the other windows, and then set it in place also like the other windows. After making sure everything was square, I set the inner flange on the wooden frame, and then screwed the inner flange to the window. This sandwiches everything together and holds the window in place. That's pretty darn solid. I'm pretty happy with that, all things considered. Yeah. That looks pretty awesome. Rinse and repeat for the other two RV windows. As you can probably tell, these two were much harder to install. I think I made the inner frames too thick, and that made screwing the inner flanges to the windows very difficult. It was a struggle, but I did manage to get them in eventually. Now it was time to work on the driver's side window. I started where I always start, measuring and cutting the hole for the window. After testing to make sure the window fit, I sanded the outer bezel, masked off the windows, and primed it because I planned to paint the outer bezel to match the rest of the bus. The next day I came back and removed the masking, and built a plywood frame for the window. In order for the frame to fit, however, I needed to make some modifications to the window. Primarily, these window latches had to be removed. They were just riveted to the aluminum frame, so I just drilled them out. I also needed to remove the inner tabs from the window, so I used a cutoff wheel to do so. I test fit the frame and... oh, looks good. Okay. Yeah, it fit perfectly. I applied butyl tape, set the window and frame into place, clamped it together to keep it from moving, and then screwed it all together. I also drove some screws through the inner frame into the plywood frame just to add a bit more strength. Now, as I was working on all of this, I had to do a floor plan in order to know where to place each window. So I'm going to back things up a bit and show you how I did that. I started at the back and used a few different paint markers to mark out where I wanted walls, windows, furniture, electrical, gas, and plumbing to go. I measured as I went and marked the walls using the hat channels as a guide. So here's the plan. Bed goes here, then the filing cabinet, then maybe electrical, then washer-dryer combo, wall, then toilet and sink, wall, countertop, stove, more countertop, and then drums. And then on the other side, driver area, computer desk, counter/eating area, sink with window above, counter, fridge, wall, shower with window, wall, clothes closet or maybe electrical, window, and then bed with TV above on the wall. Hopefully that made sense. If not, don't worry about it. I'll be making an actual proper floor plan at some point in the future to show you guys. Now, my original plan for the roof's emergency exit was to just cover it with metal and call it a day. The problem is that I didn't have enough sheet metal to completely cover the hatch, so I decided to make it into a skylight. And then I thought, while I'm at it, why don't I make this the roof access? Now, of course, this made my life difficult, but what's life without a little adversity every once in a while? So the first thing I did after removing the old hatch was to peel off the rubber seal. After that, I began taking measurements. Lots and lots of measurements. It was during this that I learned that the original hatch was not centered in the bus, which meant that I would have to cut the hole larger. I could have left it off-center, but that would have driven me nuts, and I would know that it's wrong every time I looked at it. So once I figured out what size I wanted the roof hatch to be, I measured, marked, and then cut it out with the jigsaw. After that, I used a flap wheel disc to clean up any burrs. I determined that I would make the main frame out of, you guessed it, bed frame. This took way too long to fabricate, but I basically just cut the frame to the lengths that I would need and welded it all together. Once the frame was fabricated, I test fitted it and had to make some minor adjustments so it would work. Once the frame fit properly, I welded it to the sheet metal on the roof. To add extra strength, I welded in some tabs that span the distance between the frame and the hat channels. Once I was satisfied that the frame was strong enough, I cleaned up the welds with the wire wheel, and then primed everything to keep it from rusting. So I had the main frame figured out, but I still needed a way to open the hatch, and that's where the secondary frame comes into play. I designed the secondary frame to both hold the window and to be able to open to allow access to the roof or to let fresh air in. I used 18 gauge steel, cut it into strips, and scored it so that I could bend it in the break. I then did the same process as the main frame, where I cut the steel to size and welded it all together. The only difference is that I designed this frame slightly larger because it sits over top of the main frame. I needed a way to both hinge and lock the window closed, so I cannibalized one of the emergency exit windows for parts. I first removed the latching mechanism by drilling out the rivets holding it into place. I also removed the hinge, which was held on by a combination of screws and rivets. I then modified the secondary frame to hold the handle section of the latching mechanism. I had to modify the hinge a little so that it would work with my application, and then I attached the hinge to the frame using a combination of self-tapping screws and welding. In order for the self-tapping screws to clear the hinge, I had to grind them down flatter. I then drilled the holes for the latching mechanism and riveted it together. I installed the receiver side of the latching mechanism on the main frame, and then I sanded the secondary frame to prepare for paint. I masked off the latching mechanism, and then painted the frame with self-etching primer. After the primer was dry, I came back and coated the frame with gloss black rust paint. I went to a local glass business and purchased this sheet of 1/4-inch Lexan. I had to cut it to size, so I first measured how large I wanted it to be, and then taped off where I would cut it so that it wouldn't crack from the jigsaw. Once the sheet was trimmed to size, I sanded all the edges so that they weren't so sharp. I then laid down a bead of glass sealant on the frame, and then clamped the Lexan to the frame. I also did a bead of glass sealant on the inside and outside of the frame to hopefully stop any sort of moisture from getting in. I then installed the secondary frame on the roof of the bus, and this is the final result. And that's going to be all for this week's video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking and subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but it does help this channel grow. Thank you so much for watching, enjoy your day, and I'll see you next time.